Welcome. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Just to say a few words, my name is Barbara Will. I'm the Associate Dean of the Arts and Humanities at Dartmouth. And this lecture is part of a lecture series called Why the Humanities Matter in the 21st Century. Professor Fleming, our speaker today, is the fourth speaker so far in this lecture series. We've also had the pleasure of hearing from Bill Deresiewicz, author of Excellent Sheep, from Cornell West, author of many things, and man extraordinaire. And most recently we heard from William Adams, who was the president of the NEH under Obama. And before I hand the podium over to the person who's going to introduce Professor Fleming, I just want to say a couple of things about this lecture series. So first of all, it's sponsored by the President, the Office of the President, so Phil Hanlon has generously sponsored this lecture series. And the idea of the lecture series is to look at sort of the deep traditions of the past, but also the future lines of flight that define the humanities in our moment. And I'm sure most of the people in the room today agree that the humanities are an area of focus and intellectual work that are constantly being renovated, but also have a deep and abiding relationship to the past. And it's in thinking about that relationship between past and future that we wanted to consider why the humanities matter and continue to matter in the 21st century. So our speakers are chosen for their ability to be able to address those broad and vital and urgent parts of the humanities. And they've all been absolutely compelling, and I have a feeling today's is going to be as much so, if not more so. Why don't I turn the podium over to my colleague Michael McGillen, who is a senior lecturer in the German Studies Department at Dartmouth. And he is also a scholar who works in a field very close to Paul Fleming's own, and has generously offered to introduce Professor Fleming to us today. So Michael.
Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to introduce Paul Fleming, who's a professor of comparative literature and German studies, and the Taylor Family Director of for the Society of the Humanities at Cornell University. Professor Fleming has published widely on literary theory, intellectual history, and German literature from the 18th to the 20th centuries. And he's made groundbreaking contributions to research on literary and philosophical aesthetics, especially pertaining to the theory of literary forms and genres, such as comedy, tragedy, the epic, the novel, and more recently, the anecdote. Professor Fleming is an insightful reader not only of the aesthetics of Jean-Paul and Hegel, of bourgeois tragedy and 19th century realist literature, but also of the critical theory of figures such as Georg Lukács, Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, and Hans Blumenberg. And he's been a key figure in recent years in a renaissance of interest in the work of Hans Blumenberg. And I would draw attention here to his translation of Blumenberg's Care Crosses the River, his co-editing of a special issue of the journal Telos on Blumenberg's work, and to a number of important essays. His first book, The Pleasure of Abandonment, Jean-Paul and the Life of Humor, is a study of Jean-Paul's understanding of humor as the inverted sublime, suspended between a sense of abandonment and a desire for infinity. And this appeared in 2006 with Königshausen and Neumann, and was quickly followed by his second book, Exemplarity and Mediocrity, The Art of the Average from Bourgeois Tragedy to Realism, which appeared in 2009 with Stanford University Press. Exemplarity and Mediocrity presents an innovative reading of a tension at the heart of modern literature, namely that art seeks to maintain its status as something exemplary or exceptional, while at the same time taking as its object forms of everyday experience that are ordinary and prosaic. And it's a wonderful book with readings of Lessing, of Goethe, Schiller, Grillparzer, and Stifter. And it gives an account of the struggle of German literature to represent the ordinary in an exceptional way. Fleming's recent essays and his current book project concern the use of anecdotes, as he puts it, in and as theory. And I would mention here his essays on Benjamin, on Hebel, Blumenberg, and Linnaeus, in which he shows that anecdotes, while on the one hand contingent and apparently isolated, are able to assert themselves into our life space in such a way that they demand interpretation, and hence appeal to having an exemplary status. So in the spirit of Blumenberg's metaphorology, Fleming concludes that anecdotes are not mere illustrations of theory, but rather entry points for reading and doing the work of theory. So Fleming's work, I would say in conclusion, has the charm of presenting us with theoretical insights in the form of very memorable anecdotes and examples that really stick with us as readers. And I think that the title of his lecture today, Message in a Bottle, promises to reach its audience in precisely this way. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Is that working? Yeah. Great. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Michael. And thank you for inviting me here to Dartmouth. It's a real honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak about the humanities with you today. I especially want to thank Veronica for extending the invitation, Barbara Will, Graziella Parati for already beginning discussions about the humanities via email and various projects, also Petra, Julia, and others who I've already met today. It's been a great day already at Dartmouth. So I'm looking forward to continuing the discussions that have already begun, and let's take it away. So when Veronica first sent me the invitation, I was delighted to accept and thought I'd have much to say, too much to say. But once I got down to writing this talk, I realized several difficulties about trying to address why the humanities matter. First, it is very easy to slip into platitudes or truisms about why we need the humanities for democracy, for citizenship, for critical thinking, for oral and written expression, people skills, rounded individuality. That while all this is certainly very true, very important, this can also go hand in hand with further reductions to the humanities and the perception as a mere ancillary to the social and natural sciences. Second, it is therefore hard to resist a justified but largely ineffective outrage that only a barbarian wouldn't acknowledge why the humanities matter. That thought crosses my mind once in a while, I have to say, particularly when I'm writing this talk. But this outrage, I have to say, is not an argument that will convince anybody, and certainly not the barbarians. So, I mean, that outrage is great, it's fine, but it does not help us. Third, finally, optimism. It's not bad, we're gonna be all right. This feels good, this is important, it's comforting, but it's also not enough. Since one has to accept there's a fundamental dilemma confronting the humanities today. Once one finds oneself in the position of making a case for one's importance, for having to explain one's role in education, one's role in society, one has in many ways, if not lost, ceded quite a bit of ground. Don't get me wrong, by the way. I'm very happy about this invitation. This is not about that. And we do the same thing at Cornell Society of the Humanities. We have a lecture series in the future of humanities. We need to be discussing these things. But there's a real dilemma, there's a real difficulty and dilemma in this. So we do this at Cornell. We have to discuss it. But the premise of this question at Cornell, what's the future of the humanities? Or why do humanities matter? Implies at worst you don't. Or at best, it's no longer self-evident. We are in the state of it no longer being self-evident. I was just talking about the case of Stevens Point right before the lecture today. I mean, these things aren't being cut. It is happening. It is not self-evident as to our importance. Such justification at our neoliberal juncture generally means making an economic argument for the humanities, which can be done. And this is the kind of the perverse of it. We actually do quite well career-wise, especially in the so-called peak earning years. Economically, we do okay. But this argument isn't heated, as if it cannot be heard, Because in the logic of investment, the humanities seem to be a long shot, a risky return on investment, whether that investment comes from taxpayers, the parents, or the massively indebted student. And a heavily indebted student unfortunately tends not to be a German major. This is part of the dilemma here, you know. So as long as the cost of higher education continues to rise, this is actually the big social context, as long as that continues to rise as it is, and I think equally important, I'll talk about this a bit, as long as education is seen less and less as a public good, and ever more as an economic investment in oneself in which you want to maximize that return, the humanities will have an increasingly difficult hand to play. Therefore, on my own personal scale of our ability to succeed in making the case for why the humanities matter ranges from foreboding at our future in higher education, particularly when it comes to graduate studies and PhD studies, where I see a sea change coming. I'd like to talk about that after, even though I know it's less applicable here. I think there's a lot coming down the pipeline there sooner than we think. So it goes from foreboding to guarded hope. But I have to say, hope is not a robust concept in the German tradition. So, to give you an example, actually I was going to, Michael mentioned, I had a whole series of anecdotes that I was just going to do as my talk. I've cut out most of them, but I'm happy to tell you them after in the question and answer. But, for example, one night when Franz Kafka and his good friend Max Brod were strolling down the streets of Prague and discussing the state of humanity through the theological lens of Gnosticism, nihilism, and the fallen state of the world, Brod asked Kafka if there might be hope out there. And Kafka responded joyfully with a wry smile. Oh, there's plenty of hope, an infinite amount of hope, just not for us. So, and we were talking today about lunch about kind of one-upmanship and bleakness about the humanities, this kind of sick game of like, no, it's actually worse than you think. I think with that line, I kind of win that competition for today. But, and this is the big thing, we actually cannot worry about whether the ground has shifted so much from our feet, below our feet, and from the feet of public discourse. The time, we can't worry if our time, the time of the humanities has passed or is waning. And if it has, outrage at this fact, while understandable, doesn't change things. We have no choice but to keep making the arguments for why the humanities matter, for staking a claim. Even if now might be a time without much hope, we have to act as if. It's the big as if. We have to act as if there's still an infinite amount of hope for the humanities. Hence the title of my talk, as Michael guessed it, Message in a Bottle. This phrase comes from the two German critical theorists, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, representatives of the Frankfurt School or critical theory. Message in the bottle was the metaphor they used to describe their intellectual work as philosophers, sociologists, musicologists, literary critics, intellectual historians, and cultural theorists in the midst of what they called the barbarism of the 20th century. German Jewish exiles in the United States, they weren't sure if their ideas would make a difference. Not only their analysis of fascism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism, but also of capitalism, the culture industry, one-dimensionality, and democratic unfreedom. Message in a Bottle is a mode of humanity, of the humanities in a dark time. Thus, to describe the humanities as a message in a bottle is not exactly optimistic. As a mode of communication, a message in a bottle is notably fraught. First, you send one under duress, a measure against a raging sea or a sinking ship. Second, and more importantly, you can't be sure if the message will ever arrive, if it will be read, or at the extreme, if there will be anyone left to read it, at least anyone who cares. But sending such messages also cannot be called a giving up. On the contrary, casting the bottle onto the sea still clings to the hope, back to the hope, no matter how distant in time and space, that the message will find an audience and make a difference. A hint of desperation, to be sure, but also a real desire to communicate, to get the message out there because it matters, even under the most extreme conditions. But the temporality is a bit out of joint. Given the uncertainty of when and where the bottle will wash ashore, and who may find it, if ever, such a message accepts that the addressee may, in fact, not yet be born at the time of its writing. One writes perhaps for the present world, perhaps for posterity, for an unknown future, but one writes, and that's the key thing. One keeps sending the message out there, offering a memento, the record of a sentiment, an idea to be preserved, a message that despite everything must be recorded, a form of Luther's, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. In short, you send a message in a bottle when you believe it still matters. A message in a bottle is a sign of deep concern, of deep care, even when it seems or may seem dark. And it's precisely what I call the care structure of the humanities that I want to discuss today. The humanities matter in the 21st century because of their particular relationship to care, to Latin's cura. And this comes actually from translating the Blumenberg's Care Crosses the River. A lot of these thoughts are influenced by that. And I mean care here in three senses, all etymologically related to the Latin cura, and each indicative of the humanities and why they matter in the 21st century. First, care as curiosity. Curiosity is the desire to know about potentially anything and everything because it is interesting, odd, indeed curious, worthy of care. The humanities are driven by inquisitiveness about history, politics, philosophy, literature, art, music, culture, ideas, about expressions across time and place as goods, as values in themselves, as valuable to society, to the public good, beyond economic concerns. It is about asking questions, the big ones, the small ones, that do not or may not have an immediate answer or even one answer. Questions that produce not necessarily answers, but more questions to pursue. In other words, care as curiosity is about the primacy of the question, posing questions, good questions. Second, care as curation, or as the curatorial imperative. More than the other sciences, the task of the humanities is to take care of, to preserve, not just the big ideas, the dominant themes and questions, but also the forgotten, the marginal, the small, the imperceptible. The humanities brush history against the grain in the name of all the things that are not immediately recalled or valued by society. The humanities matter because we play an essential curatorial role, excavating, archiving, keeping alive, that is demanding the importance of the myriad people, ideas, moments, artworks, and cultures that would otherwise fall outside the annals of history. And if the day comes when this is no longer possible or reduced within the walls of the university, if the university is not dedicated in its mission of curating, caring for culture and its multiplicity, we will need an army of aficionados, dilettantes, and curious others to do this essential work of humanity. Care as curation is about the imperative of preservation. Finally, care as worry, as concern about society. There's a societal mission to the university in general, and the humanities in particular. And it's precisely the social role that is being radically called into question. I think this is essential. This is part of the crux of the matter. Scott Walker, we had to mention him, governor of my home state, I come from Wisconsin, infamously went after unions and universities. We know this. What I didn't realize until writing this talk is that in 2015, he also attempted to amend what is known as the Wisconsin idea. I grew up with Wisconsin idea, which is written into the state code, namely that the university's explicit mission is to serve the public good. Luckily, he failed at this, but he wanted to change the statute in the state code defining this mission by first adding that the goal of the university is foremost, quote, to meet the state's workforce needs. This comes as no surprise. We've seen this in Florida, North Carolina, Kentucky. It's throughout the nation. We know the quotes. A greater cause for concern, I believe, is the language Walker wanted to eliminate. Namely, the university's mission is to, quote, to extend knowledge and its application beyond the boundaries of the campus, and to quote, and quote, to serve and stimulate society. Both these phrases he simply crossed out, just crossed them out, gone. So too, he proposed removing the last line of the mission statement, quote, basic to the purpose of the system is the search for truth. That too, truth had to go. That truth is dangerous or controversial is a bit of a head scratcher, I find, but more symptomatic of our political moment. One that will not fade quickly is Walker's attempt to excise the relationship between university and society, between the university and the public good. When the twin goals of extending knowledge beyond the boundaries of the campus and serving society. I mean, we should be rebuked if we're not doing that. That should be the problem. But if these two things, extending knowledge beyond the boundaries of the campus and serving society, are seen as incongruous with the mission of a university, much less a public university, one financed by the society is to serve, then it's clear that higher education is no longer seen as a public good, not part of the social mission, neither in bearing its costs, nor in expecting collective social benefits from it, hence the slashed state budgets. Rather, education is an individual choice, an investment in oneself with all the risk and reward this model entails, including the massive student debt. It also means that not only economic concerns, jobs are at stake, no, much more. It is also the desire to see the university stripped of any reflection on and engagement with society, talking public humanities, and how education relates to society, its governance, which is probably seen as a liberal agenda, and thus the university is an incubator for it. And this is a debate that we have largely lost. So, and the first to go in this, to be jettisoned in this new paradigm, is the humanities, which we saw at Stevens Point, or the attempt at Stevens Point last week, which tend to have the most deep social embedded most deeply in their fabric. Therefore, care as concern is concern for society, for the primacy of social and sociality. So what follows are a series of messages and bottles, ideas and anecdotes. Again, I work on anecdotes to elucidate what I mean with the care structure of the humanities. Curiosity as the question, curation as preservation, and care as concern, as worry for the social, and why, therefore, the humanities matter all the more in the 21st century. So first message in a bottle, care as curiosity. It feels a bit trite to start here, to go back to the beginning of the West, so to speak. But I simply recall that Aristotle leads all thinking, all philosophy back to taumatzen, to wonder, amazement, curiosity. It is wonder, a question, a curiosity in the face of the unknown or what one does not know that compels the movement of thought, of thinking to begin. An origin, I note, that is different than need, which aspires to a practical solution, an answer. Curiosity, more often than not, simply leads to more questions, more wonder. For Aristotle, wonder is explicitly a mode of questioning and discovery beyond practicality, though it may also lead to practical results. He not only famously writes that, quote, it is through wonder that men begin, and probably did mean men begin to philosophize, end of quote, but much more importantly, Aristotle locates this taumatzen, this curiosity, this wonder, in a desire for knowledge beyond its practical applicability. Quote, if it is to escape ignorance that men study philosophy, it is obvious that they pursue science for the sake of knowledge and not for any practical utility. End of quote. In short, one desires knowledge, philosophia, the love of wisdom, for its own sake, for the pleasure of knowing and addressing one's own ignorance. Curiosity may ultimately dovetail with practical purposes, but applicability does not drive it. It is simply the desire to explore, find out, burrow into details, expand horizons, think in different ways, question and question further. Now, the humanities have no particular purchase on this form of care as curiosity. Doctors, chemists, biologists, botanists, statisticians, computer programmers, data analysts all have it, all should have it. This is where we should find great common cause with the natural and social sciences at liberal arts institutions. There's great room for collaboration here. Nor is curiosity so antithetical to the job-driven concerns of governors, chancellors, parents, and trustees. This is the part I find truly perplexing. The entire innovation economy, the pride of the US, is fueled by curiosity, and only a portion which ends up being marketable. One needs a wealth of curiosity for a bit of innovation, and we can help provide that curiosity. This necessary excess, the incalculable flow of curiosity, escapes the cost-benefit ledgers to the detriment of the possible benefits. Insofar as curiosity is not driven by a clearly identifiable end, a desired outcome, it's not a problem set, but simply follows where thought leads it. The humanities add an extra fire to curiosity, the will to discovery. So I give one example of curiosity, the desire to know and experience at all costs, even if it leads down somewhat curious paths. So as Michael mentioned, I wrote my dissertation on the German author Johann Paul Friedrich Richter, whose nom de plume was Jean-Paul. My curiosity in Jean-Paul was piqued by perhaps the greatest writer ever imagined by literature, by Wutz. I'm sure you've all read Wutz. No, I'm sure none of you have read Wutz, but you should go out and read Wutz now. The story is called The Life of the Cheerful Little Schoolmaster Maria Wutz in Auenthal. My fascination began with the most fantastic library I've ever encountered in literature, one that predates Kafka by well over a century, by Borges by much longer. Wutz has a library like no other. He's an enthusiastic reader at the dawn of the 19th century, the story was written in 1793, who wants to stay abreast of the rapidly advancing zeitgeist, but has one major problem. He has no money to purchase the books he wants to read. He's not only poor in the spirit of times, but quite literally just damn poor. The only book he can afford is the one he can get for free, the catalog of books to appear. But Wutz's solution to this juncture between his absolutely curious mind, in German it's Neugier, which is the lust, the craving for the new. That's curious, the lust, the craving for the new. His solution to this disjuncture between his absolutely curious mind and his all too limited financial means is as brilliant as it is mad. After procuring a copy of the catalog of books to appear, it's free, and dutifully studying the forthcoming titles, Wutz gets down to work, writing every word of the books he wants to read based solely on the title in the catalog. He thus fills his library, this is the library I've always wanted to see, with all the decisive books of the 18th century, handwritten, absolutely singular versions of Kant's First Critique, Schiller's The Robbers, Goethe's The Sufferings of Young Werther. They're all there, composed by Wutz himself, which he then turns around and studies with the love of a philologist. What did Goethe want to say? In some ways, the Wutzian Curiosity Project, as I call it, this monstrous undertaking in self-edification, performs the most Herculean of hermeneutic endeavors, to define the entire content of a book from its title alone. He tries to answer the age-old question, what's in a title? How much can you read into and out of a title? But this mad endeavor also lies at the heart of the humanities. The unabashed desire to address one's ignorance, one's perplexity, to seek ideas and insights simply because such thought is important. His is true curiosity, formed by the Latin cura, the care for ideas for their own sake, because one simply needs to know, wants to know. How can you live, he asks himself, how can you live in the 1790s and not read Goethe, Schiller, and Kant? Wutz's library exhibits then a true form of radical humanistic imagination, a power of curiosity beyond any measurable utility. It's an exponential version of Aristotle's Tamatsein. Sure, you can call this writing project, the writing career, the ultimate act of laughable futility, since this passionate project is premised on writing the canonical works that in fact already exist, a massive investment of time without any real return. But on the other hand, this waste of time arises solely from the desire to be of the time, to participate in the zeitgeist that Wutz knows only appears thanks to and in imagination. He's matching imagination by imagination. In producing a parallel library of 18th century literature, a double and shadow world of ideas written by himself, Wutz both fails in achieving the works of Kant, Goethe, and Schiller, and in a decisive way matches them, may even outstrip them in the insistence on imagination. Goethe, one could say, just had to write The Sufferings of Young Werther. That was hard enough. Wutz had to one-up him. He had to imagine what Goethe imagined in writing it, a fantasy to the second power, this hyper-fantasy. Now, the Wutzian Curiosity Project is certainly a case of hyper-wonder beyond the bounds that Aristotle ever would have endorsed, to be honest. But this will to know, even when the words quite literally are already out there, but beyond his grasp. And yet I want to argue that this type of radical curiosity, this boundless imagination, will be required more and more, actually, of governments, institutions, and citizens in the 21st century. While the single-minded concern about job and career preparation is lamentable, particularly at research universities with liberal arts undergraduate education, it's also understandable but only if you assume that everything, the way we know and live in the world, will continue more or less unchanged into the indefinite future. But this is far too short-sighted, and I'm not simply talking about the relationship between curiosity and values other than economic ones, much less the relationship between curiosity and innovation, which is fully compatible with capitalism and free markets. Rather, I mean short-sighted with respect to world-changing problems facing humanity on this planet, the most clear-cut being climate change, what Amitav Ghosh calls the great derangement. In a few generations, this will probably be a vastly different planet. For some, especially the most vulnerable, it already is becoming a vastly different planet. Paris Accord was signed 2 years ago this April. 2 years out, this week, not a single major industrial nation is anywhere near on track to fulfill its commitments. Not one. Trump's withdrawal of the US, while indicative and maddening, does not change this fact. The premise of Paris was to keep the planet under 2 degrees of Celsius of warming, which is already defined as the threshold to climate catastrophe. And only 7 nations, 7 total, the most prominent being India, are even within range, though over, of the agreement. This should give real pause. The fact is, we have to assume that the world will not meet the Paris Accord. The downer side of this talk. And if climate science is right, and it's been pretty reliable so far, and there's no reason to doubt it, then we need to start planning, unfortunately, for a very different planet, and a planet that might be a very worse planet, a much harder planet. In other words, there's another side to climate denial, which is denying the real effects that we know when we believe in the climate science. And if we're not meeting these goals, then we need to start thinking, what is this going to mean for life on this planet? Such planning will not simply be a question of engineers, dams, water and fire barriers, electric cars, solar and wind, carbon capture, but also of radical imagination and curiosity, a quasi-Wutzian desire to figure things out in unconventional, unexpected ways. In other words, to reimagine community, resources, travel, politics, narratives of history, progress, can we even speak of progress anymore, of nationhood, citizenship, of humanity's place in the universe, of how to live together not only with one another but with other species on the planet. Such imaginative curiosity, basically rethinking our lives on this planet, will certainly not only come from the humanities, but a good dose of humanistic imagination and curiosity will certainly help. Artists, ethicists, political theorists, philosophers, literary scholars, anthropologists, historians. We will need some real curiosity and not just to worry about careers. But before moving on to the second aspect of what I call the care structure of the humanities, I do want to note that curiosity is not an unqualified good. It too has its blind spots. Curiosity also characterizes, for example, the colonial gaze, the fetishization of the foreign other. There can be, in short, a false amazement, a false curiosity, that it's not the start of thought, but a barrier to it. Walter Benjamin, writing in the Paris exile, 1940, just before he was to commit suicide on the border to Spain while trying to escape the Nazis, minces no words in indicting such perverted amazement, especially in dark times. Quote from Benjamin, "The current," 1940, as the Nazis are taking over Paris, "the current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical." He's referring to Aristotle. "The current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical. This amazement is not the beginning of knowledge, unless it is the knowledge that the view of history which gives rise to it is untenable." He's talking about progress, belief in progress. End of quote. We cannot be amazed when progress seems to come to a halt, when humans revert to atrocities, whether in the form of fascism, authoritarianism, or climate change. Progress is not given. It may not be at all, and thus one cannot assume in the spirit of progress that we'll figure it out, technology will find a solution, we'll find a solution. No, Benjamin's admonishment was equally written for today. Any amazement, surprise, or wonder, curiosity in the face of the resurgence of authoritarianism, nationalism, racism, populism in the US, England, France, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, Italy, Russia, and Germany is misplaced amazement, not the start of philosophical reflection. The same with our lack of response to climate change. Sometimes the beginning of thought, I want to say, in other words, true curiosity, is to no longer be amazed by anything. This sober curiosity also must belong to the humanities. Second message in a bottle, care as the curatorial imperative. With the curatorial imperative, I mean that the humanities must attend to details, small things, take care of things, of ideas, and thereby interact with, organize, and arrange the ideas and cultural practices we care about. We curate ideas and objects so as to preserve and bring them to a new life in new context. Reanimation as curation, or via curation. The curatorial is a mode of preservation that attends to the small and forgotten. This form of care, or cura, is harder to sell, to win public support for, because its premise is that the humanities cares for, and values what society and its economic paradigm generally doesn't. People, languages, learning foreign languages, history, artifacts, and stories that are all worth knowing, preserving, and curating in their own right. Therefore, it's the curatorial mode that most likely marks the difference between the surviving and the thriving of the humanities. Now, with surviving the humanities, I mean that there will always be a role for the humanities. This I'm not worried about. Often defined in terms of critical thinking, instruction, democracy, citizenship, a well-rounded education, learning to argue, people skills, all those things, enabled by some knowledge of US history, world literature, oral and written expression, text analysis. This is certainly important, no doubt, but in survival mode, the humanities merely serve an ancillary role, the humanizing function, as students are moved towards more career-driven areas of education. Surveys, in fact, clearly show that even employers want students, qua future workers, to have an even better skills in the humanities, in comprehension, expression, critical thinking. But this ancillary role for the humanities can largely be served by minors, certificates, and a few capacious majors, literature or English departments, history, US society. Again, what we saw at Stephen's Point this week. All with cascading detrimental effects on PhD studies. Again, that will be the first chip that we need to worry about potentially falling. When the humanities thrive, though, as compared to over against surviving, when they thrive, they are seen as a good, as a value pursued for their own sake. Such a status recognizes that there are values, shared social values, that are not economic and nonetheless deserve support as a public good. In the ancillary role, the humanities are a means to an end, an expression of what Adorno Horkheimer would call instrumental reason. When they thrive, the humanities are an end in themselves. It is simply good and important in society that it be possible to study the Middle Ages, classical languages, less common languages, Southeast Asia, the Global South, art, history, poetry, you name it. Without curiosity, the desire to know because it's good and pleasurable and interesting in its own right, and without the curatorial mode, that these expressions of human life are worth preserving, studying, learning from, the humanities will survive but lose their urgency and impact. This is the second sense of care, to curate, to assume this curatorial role, a heeding and preserving of the small. I give one example of this curatorial gaze, this attention to the small, that comes from Benjamin's friend, one-time friend, and dialogue partner Ernst Bloch, in his 1930 book Traces, a neglected masterpiece of narrative thinking, of narrative thinking, of thinking in stories. The example I give is less the curation of content and more the training of the eye one needs for it. So at the beginning of Traces from 1930, one encounters a story with the title Das Merke in German, which can be translated somewhat stilted as the Nota Bene, or the act of noting well. But the stiltedness is important since the anecdote is an exercise in the curatorial gaze, the eye for the stilted and seizing upon it. The story begins as follows in Bloch's rather elliptical, poetic style of thinking. It's a quote from Ernst Bloch's Traces. More and more appears among us to the side, on the periphery. One should observe precisely the small things. One should pursue them. What is slight and odd often leads the furthest. One hears the story, for example, about the soldier who arrived too late for roll call. He doesn't insert himself into the ranks, but rather stands next to the officer, who thereby notices nothing. Apart from the amusement that this story provides, an impression is still working. What was that? What happened? Something moved. Something was possible. And it moved, became possible in its own way. This is an impression that doesn't let us come to rest. An impression on the surface of life so that it, the surface, tears, perhaps. In short, it is also good to think in stories. End of quote from Bloch. This anecdote is a propedeutic in taking care of curating, collecting, or reflecting on the small and slightly askew, paying attention to the aberrant. The content is minimal, but the process is everything. It's a story that one may not really take note of. There's actually little to nota bene. A soldier, a subordinate, arrives late and doesn't take his proper place, standing instead with his superiors. While including pleasure, the effect exceeds amusement to leave an impression. Something moved, something happened, something was possible. And I lost my... Yep. In other words, there's something out of line, and yet there was no retribution, and in fact, the insubordination was not even noticed. But why the soldier acted as he did? Did he intend this? Was it a mistake? Was it a joke? We don't know. There's no psyche, no interiority, just the act and the trace it leaves behind. The curatorial gaze is not about putting yourself into the shoes of the other, but allowing that scene, the other, to enter into and affect your own space. The event enters the space of the reader, imposes itself upon the present time and present conditions. That's why I want to say curation is not simply about the past, it's about the present and the way that past affects the present, no matter how distant. So all we know is that nothing was noticed by the officer. And this nothing is precisely the something that the reader should take note of, to ponder, to preserve. This is the trace, that's the title of the book, this is the trace of the other order found precisely in the small, the slightly askew. Perhaps it's not revolutionary, but it's not nothing. That's the key thing, it's not nothing. By not joining the ranks where he belongs, something is not where it belongs, the reader gains the sense, the hope that something is possible. Curating the small, the imperceptible, therefore, not only observes, preserves, and offers new life to what may fall into oblivion, but it also works with it, thinks alongside it, and its possibilities, its openings, the small tears that it may enable on the surface of life. Third message in a bottle, care as concern for society. I mentioned above that in taking careers ever more into account when considering the role of higher education, we are being far too short-sighted, fatally so. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to democracy, when it comes to justice and inequality, racism, xenophobia, locally and globally, the university and the humanities must attend to concern themselves with the social, with society, and this very complex project of living in common with other people. In thinking through the challenges that massive multiple sources of information, no matter how dubious or fake, can now play in shaping and, more importantly, in fracturing the polis. In addressing the mind-boggling power that big data can now exert in the democratic process, from targeted news to laser precision and redistricting, it's clear that the questions now raised go beyond technical skills and demand reflections on ethics, politics, evaluating information, and questions of democracy and freedom. Here, the humanities need a seat at the table and need to demand it. I was talking with Petra this morning at breakfast that there's a long human history of fakes, forgeries, misinformation to be studied and learned from as part of a really deep history of media history and the way media has constantly been in conflict with these types of fake news. That, at a minimum, has to be one of our messages in the bottom, one of the demands we make. When the Brexit vote took place 2 summers ago, 2016, I remember waking up in Berlin, stunned, and thinking, this is exactly why we need the humanities. When Trump was elected in November 2017, I woke up again in Berlin, stunned, and here I have to admit this is my own version of Benjamin's false amazement. and thought again, my God, we need the humanities more than ever. And then I told a friend this story, and this friend said, you just have to stop waking up in Berlin and this will all stop. So that's the other solution to this. But it's clear when I said, this is why we need the humanities more than ever, it's clear that economic analysis alone will not suffice. Neither will quantitative analysis. Neither will, and this is coming from critical theory, neither will reason and mere education. It's not simply a question of having better information or relying on deliberative reason and the best argument holding sway. That's not entirely the case. One therefore also needs the wide net cast by humanistic inquiry and methodology, cultural, historical, rhetorical, psychological, medial, ethnographic, religious analysis to engage with the motivations, wishes, worldviews, perspectives, repressions, and desires of people across time and place in different parts of the country, economic, social, and religious backgrounds. It's at this historical juncture when Western liberal democracy is no longer a settled affair, it's no longer self-evident itself. When the refugee crisis, the rise of nationalism, racism, populism will continue their course, if not increase. When the precarity of the working class in a global economy, which will be only exponentially ratcheted up by AI in the coming years, all this, when this potentially is worsening, then we will not only need the humanities engagement with the social in all of its complexity, a complexity that cannot be reduced to one answer, but we will need them especially at places like Dartmouth and Cornell. Let me explain. After growing up in the Midwest, I grew up in Milwaukee. I spent all my years studying and teaching on the East Coast and its cities. I went to undergrad work at Brown and Providence. I did my graduate work at Hopkins in Baltimore. And then my first 10 years of teaching were at NYU right on Washington Square. Therefore, when I moved to Cornell in 2011, my one worry was moving from a city of 8 million to an isolated town of 30,000+, which I realize now I'm in a big city after coming here. So I actually feel like I'm the cosmopolitan guy coming from Ithaca. But my one worry was moving from 8 million, to a global metropolis to a city of 30, or town of 30,000. But what I never thought, never imagined in 2011 was that in a few years, precisely by living in Ithaca, that I would find myself on the front lines of politics, the great political divide. Colleges like Dartmouth, like Cornell, may be geographically isolated, but politically, we stand in the middle. We stand in that very gap. If we want to assert the centrality of humanities for today's world, then we need to stand up and engage with, work with, discuss with, collaborate with the communities around us. Here too, we have often failed or ignored them. So, Bro Adams was recently here, the chairman of the NEH. 2015, he launched the initiative, The Common Good, the Humanities in the Public Square, where he called upon, quote, humanists to engage in illuminating the grand challenges we now face as a nation, and emphasize, quote, the relevance of the humanities to the current conditions of national life. That was 2015. 2018, this appeal is much more urgent when questions of democracy, inequality, division, civility, and discourse need to be grappled with as a common challenge. And the humanities, with the care structure of curiosity, curation, concern, all with respect to this insistence on the social, the humanities can help lead the way. In many ways, it's precisely institutions like Dartmouth, like Cornell, elite universities located in rural communities that are positioned to foster and participate in these dialogues. It's the rural universities that quite literally have a unique calling at this moment to engage with, listen to, and work with the concerns, worries, and hopes of its neighbors and local communities. We're strangely back to the classical urban-rural divide with all the pressing need to deal with it. This can take many forms. It can be community reads, it can be public humanities, it can be working in high schools, grade schools, especially local libraries that provide entire network through the countryside. It can be the rural novel, it can be pastoral poetry, it can be any number of things that one works on. It can be education, it can be art, community discussions, exploring the rural landscape and rural history, visualizing Native history, Native American history, migrant history, settler history, slave history, all now done for the 21st century, for these deeper histories of the rural countryside, whatever. The possibilities are endless, often untapped, and desperately needed for the demos. Now, will any of this work? Will any of it make a difference? I don't know. I really don't know. That too is a message in a bottle, but one we have to write and cast onto the sea to see if it makes it ashore. Thank you.